Harriet Tubman, Chapter 18, A Wagon Load of Bricks. From 1851 to 1857, the country moved closer to civil war. During these years, Harriet Tubman made 11 trips into Maryland to bring out slaves. In November 1856, she rescued Joe Bailey. In the spring, she had made 2 trips to the eastern shore. The result of one of these trips is recorded in Still's Underground Railroad, April 1856. The next arrival numbered 4 passengers and came under the guidance of Moses, Harriet Tubman, from Maryland. The second trip, which took place in May, is mentioned in a letter that Thomas Garrett wrote to J. Miller McKim and William Still of the Philadelphia Vigilance Committee. Wilmington, 5 months, 11th, 1856. Esteemed friends, McKim and Still, those 4 I wrote thee about arrived safe up in the neighborhood of Longwood, and Harriet Tubman followed after in the stage yesterday. I shall expect 5 more from the same neighborhood next trip. As ever, your friend, Thomas Garrett. The November trip started off inauspiciously. There were 3 men in the group, Joe Bailey and his brother William, and a man named Peter Pennington. There was 1 woman, Eliza Noki. After Harriet heard Joe's story, her fear of immediate pursuit increased. Joe was a tall, dark man, muscular and handsome. His master had hired him out to another planter, William R. Hewlett, for 6 years. Finally, Hewlett decided to buy him, for Joe supervised the running of the plantation so well that Hewlett didn't have to pay an overseer. He paid $2,000 for Joe. Joe said the day Hewlett bought him, he beat him with a rawhide to make certain Joe knew who was the master. Joe told them he had said to himself, "This is the first and the last time." That night he took a boat and rowed down the river to the plantation where old Ben lived. He told Ben, "The next time Moses comes, let me know." The scars on Joe's back weren't healed yet. Harriet worried about that. His height, the bloody stripes on his back, would make it easy to identify him. Perhaps it was the worry, the haste with which they had to move to get away, the fact that she felt impelled to urge them to move faster and faster. Anyway, her head began to ache. She made them walk along the edge of the road, dangerous, but going through the woods was too slow. As she hurried them along, the scar from the old wound on her temple began to throb like a toothache. The ache in her head increased. She could feel sleep creeping over her like paralysis. She tried to sing, tried to fight off the sleep, and stumbled, went down on her knees, and was sound asleep. When she awakened, she had no idea how long she had slept. She heard a man's voice saying, "You've got to trust her. When she has those sleeps, you have to leave her alone till she wakes up. She'll wake up pretty soon." It was Joe who had spoken. He was squatting on his heels, and Eliza and Bill and Peter were standing up, looking down at her. She was lying flat on the road. The sun was shining, sunlight so bright that she thought she could feel it warm on her eyelids. Yet the ground was cold, the air was cold. She got to her feet quickly. Her heart seemed to be skipping beats. It was going so fast. They were out in plain sight, all of them. Anyone who passed would recognize them for what they were, runaways, fugitives. She ordered them to follow her and went into the woods that bordered the road, plunging into the woods, almost running. They came behind her, and it seemed to her their footsteps kept pace with the speed of her thoughts. Should have been traveling at night, not in broad daylight. Should have been concealed, not out in the open like that. Gotta go faster, and faster, faster, faster. Then she heard them muttering. One of the men said, "She's taking us back, I can tell. We're going back the same way we came. The woman's crazy." She led them on a zigzag course up a hill and then down. On the foot of the hill there was a small river, which followed a winding course. She went straight toward it. Eliza Noki said, panic in her voice, "You go and wade that?" Harriet said she had had a dream while she was sleeping, and in the dream she had seen this river. Eliza said it was too deep to wade, they'd all drown. Harriet said she was certain there was one place so shallow that they could wade it. They stopped following her. All of them stopped. Bill asked her if she'd crossed this river before. She said no, but she'd seen it in her dream, that the Lord told her what to do, and the running water leaves no trail. They would be safe on the other side. Peter Pennington said, "I'll wade no freezing water for no crazy woman," and started back towards the woods. She raised the gun, pointed it, scowling. "Stand still," she ordered. "You try to go back, try to run back to the woods, and you'll never run any more. You go on with me or you die." This went on. She didn't like it. The threat of violence always disturbed her. and she had never felt so unsure of herself, so desperate, so afraid. But her visions had never failed her. She waded into the stream. Water like ice was around her ankles, and as she went forward, it reached her thighs and then her waist. She turned and looked back, and Joe was the only one who had followed her. The others were standing on the bank watching. Water reached to her shoulders, and she kept going. She closed her eyes for a moment, in the grip of a despair as icy cold as the water. She thought that if her belief were only strong enough, the waters of the stream would have parted, and they would all have walked across on dry land. Instead, the water rose higher, and now it was above her shoulders, up to her chin. She kept going. She held the gun up out of the water. At least Joe was still following, and she thought, wade in the water just like John, and a feeling of confidence returned. When the Lord no longer wanted her, the water began to recede. It was down to her shoulders, but it wasn't the water that was receding. The stream was getting shallower. When the others saw this, they started to wade the river too. Then all of them reached the opposite bank. Dry land, a small island or neck of island. They were shivering, shocked by the cold, numb, but otherwise unharmed. They went through more woods, and then they came to a clearing. There was a cabin there. Harriet said she had seen that in her dreams too. They would be safe there, and they were. The cabin belonged to a family of free Negroes. They were made welcome, given food. Their wet clothing was dried in front of the open fire. The next morning they set out again. They went back the same way they had come, but they did not have to wade through the river. Their host served as guide, and he led them by a long roundabout road. When they reached the spot where Harriet had gone to sleep by the side of the road the day before, they all shivered. The patrollers had been there, had waited for them there. If they hadn't crossed that river at Harriet's direction, they would have been caught. The evidence was unmistakable. The grass had been trampled by horses' feet. The ground was littered with stubs of half-smoked cigars. A poster had been nailed to one of the trees. They recognized it immediately. In the upper left corner, there was a woodcut of a black man, a small running figure with a stick over his shoulder and a bundle tied to the end of the stick, and another stick in his hand. Harriet tore the poster down and handed it to Joe. He read it out loud. Heavy reward, $2,600 reward. Ran away from the subscriber on Saturday night, November 15th, 1856. Josiah and William Bailey and Peter Pennington. Joe was about 5 feet 10 inches in height, of a chestnut color, bald head, with a remarkable scar on one of his cheeks. Not positive on which it is, but think it is on the left, under the eye. Has intelligent countenance, active and well made. He is about 28 years old. Bill is of a darker color, about 5 feet 8 inches in height. Stammers a little when confused. Well made and older than Joe. Well dressed, but may have pulled kersey on over their other clothes. Peter is smaller than either the others, about 25 years of age, dark chestnut color, 5 feet 7 or 8 inches high. A reward of $1,500 will be given to any person who will apprehend the said Joe Bailey and lodge him safely in the jail at Easton, Talbot County, Maryland. And $300 for Bill and $800 for Peter. W.R. Hewlett, John C. Henry T. Wright. When Joe finished reading, there was silence. Harriet tried to say something, and her voice was only a croaking sound in her throat. Again she tried to speak and couldn't. She must have caught cold from the river. What would she do? Bill sighed. Then Peter groaned. Eliza Noki was angry. No one had offered any reward for her return. Then Joe started to sing. He looked at that poster, which meant any man who read it would be tempted to start hunting for the slave, who was worth $1,500 to his master, crumpled it up in his hand, and started to sing. They hurried in a northerly direction, and Joe kept singing, softly under his breath, "The little wheel run by faith, and the big wheel run by the grace of God, a wheel within a wheel, way in the middle of the air." As they went along, Harriet sensed danger everywhere, smelled danger. They were not safe. She herded them along, sometimes going ahead of them, sometimes walking behind them, prodding them with the butt of the gun, the hoarseness preventing her from speaking. It was Joe who talked, Joe who encouraged them, Joe who, as if by instinct, told the old stories about the slave ships, the torture, the irons, and the whips. When he sang, they moved faster. Eliza Noki fairly skipped along, and as Joe sang, his voice almost a whisper, "Who comes yonder all dressed in red? I heard the angel singing. It's all the children Moses led. I heard the angels singing. They saw other places along the road where the patrollers had been, found one place where they must have waited for as much as an hour, in the hope that they would be able to find some trace of this party. The horses had been tied to the trees. Joe shook his head and stopped singing. It was daybreak when they reached the outskirts of Wilmington. Within sight of the long bridge, Harriet called a halt. She told the runaways to hide in the woods, not to speak to anyone, not to make a sound, not to move. She watched the bridge for a long time. It was guarded. There were posters nailed to the trees all along the road. Stealthily, cautiously, she took 2 of the posters down and went back to where she left the runaways. Joe said one of the posters was the one he'd read to them before, and the reward for him had been increased to $2,000. But the other, the little running figure reproduced on the flimsy paper, was that of a woman. The reward offered for her capture was $12,000. The poster described her. It said she was dark, short, of a muscular build, with a deep voice, and that she had a scar on her left temple, scars on the back of her neck. Her name was Harriet Tubman. Sometimes she was called Moses. Harriet laughed. She said nobody was going to catch her. She left them again and went as close to the bridge as she dared, waiting, watching. Thomas Garrett must know about those posters. Must know the bridge was watched. He would try to get in touch with her. She was certain of it. He did. Garrett sent his servant out to look for Harriet. When Harriet saw him, she signaled to him. They held a conference in the long grass by the side of the road. Then he went back to the report to Garrett. 2 hours later, he was back again with Garrett's message. It was dark when Harriet returned to the fugitives. As she went toward their hiding place, she signaled her approach by singing, "Go down, Moses." Her voice was no longer beautiful. It was like the croaking of a frog, hoarse, tuneless. She told them to follow her. She took them through the woods and then along a road, heavy woods on each side of it, more like a country lane than a road. There was a long wagon there, and men, and the sound of horses, jingle of harness, stamping of feet, soft blowing out of breath. They got in the wagon, one by one, and lay down flat. Harriet said the men were bricklayers. She said that the men would cover them with bricks. When the men put boards over them, Eliza Noki made a thin, high sound of terror, and Harriet heard her whisper, "It's like being in a coffin." Then the bricks were placed on top of the boards. Harriet thought, Eliza is right. It is as though we had died together and have been buried in a common grave, and croaked, "We gotta go free or die." The words were lost. The wagon started. There was a sound of hoofbeats. The men on the wagon began to laugh and shout and sing. Then they were on the long bridge, and someone cried, "Halt!" The driver shouted, "Whoa, whoa." When he was asked if he had seen any runaway Negroes, he laughed and said that with that kind of money being offered for them, he planned to start hunting for them as soon as he got home right after supper. When they got out of the wagon at Thomas Garrett's house in Wilmington, Garrett said of Harriet, she was so hoarse she could hardly speak, and was also suffering with violent toothache. Garrett forwarded them to Philadelphia, where William Still wrote down their past history in his record book. From Philadelphia, they were forwarded to the office of the Anti-Slavery Society in New York. When they reached New York, it was Joe who lost his courage. The moment they entered the office of Oliver Johnson, head of the New York Anti-Slavery Society, Johnson glanced at Joe and said, "Well, Joe, I'm glad to see the man who is worth $2,000 to his master." Joe looked as though he were going to faint. He said, "How did you know me, sir?" "Here is the advertisement. From the description, no one could possibly mistake you." "How far off is Canada?" Joe asked. Oliver Johnson showed him a map. "It's more than 300 miles by railroad." Joe said he wouldn't go any further because he would be hunted every step of the way, and he couldn't stand it any longer. If a man who had never seen him could recognize him from the description, then the whole dream of freedom was hopeless. He told Harriet to take the others and go on. None of them would be safe as long as he was with them. But Harriet said they would not go without him. Finally, reluctantly, he went with them. She said afterward, "From that time Joe was silent. He talked no more, sang no more. He sat with his head on his hand, and nobody could rouse him, or make him take any interest in anything." They were put aboard a train, and they passed through New York State without incident. The conductor had hidden them in the baggage car. But when they approached Niagara Falls, he took them into one of the coaches. Harriet tried to rouse Joe from his apathy and urged him to look at Niagara, but he still sat with his head in his hands, refusing to look. Then he shouted, You've crossed the line. You're free, Joe, you're free." The others shouted too. Still he sat, bent over, silent. Harriet shook him. Joe! Joe! You're a free man!" Slowly he straightened up in his seat and then stood up and lifted his hands and began to sing. There were tears streaming down his cheeks as he sang, louder and louder. "Glory to God and Jesus too. One more soul got safe. Glory to God and Jesus too, for all these souls got safe." His voice was like the sound of thunder. Harriet, listening, thought it put a glory over all of them. By 1856, there was a civil war in Kansas. In April, May, and June, most of the speeches made in Congress concerned Kansas. Toward the end of May, old John Brown, accompanied by four of his sons, a son-in-law, and 2 other men, headed for Pottawatomie, where they murdered 5 pro-slavery settlers. An action was set off guerrilla warfare in Kansas. Henceforth, John Brown was known as Bloody Brown or Pottawatomie Brown. And that's the end of chapter 18.